Fashion's worst nightmare may have just come true. Last week, Trump announced a massive shift in foreign trade policy, and the industry is worried these so-called Liberation Day tariffs are actually the beginning of the end for fashion. We need to talk about the absolute chaos this has caused in the fashion industry already, what brands have been scrambling to put in place, and what this might mean for the fashion industry and consumers going forward. It is truly hitting the fan, and we need to talk about it. Before we do, if you're new to the channel, my name's Katie. I talk a lot about the fashion industry and sustainable fashion, so this video is going to be very focused on that. If you're into that, then hit subscribe, follow me on socials, and let's get into it. So, okay, you might be aware because everyone's talking about it, but let's quickly discuss what happened last week. Trump has been super busy upending global trade with his new wave of tariffs, which have now confirmed that goods coming into the US will face a minimum tariff of 10%. Fashion and footwear and apparel goods being no exception to this. Actually, it seems Trump has shown a particular interest in the fashion industry. Hence the absolute panic going on in fashion right now as brands and suppliers struggle to make sense and figure out what they're going to do in the wake of these sweeping changes. As Vogue explained it, key fashion producing regions integral to both mass market and luxury brand supply chains are facing particularly harsh measures. These include China, which is fashion's biggest manufacturer, Vietnam, which is a massive player in fashion's footwear market, Bangladesh, and the EU, which all landed on the list for reciprocal tariffs, meaning significantly higher duties, ranging from 20% to Europe to 54% for China. And as I keep mentioning, this has absolutely rocked the fashion industry. The US is a massive clothing market. Over 98% of the clothing sold in the US is imported from another country. And the seemingly new global trade war that's just started has big implications for fashion and their stock market prices. The day after Trump announced these sweeping tariffs, it was absolute pandemonium. Fashion stock prices were down across the board. Throughout the athleisure, luxury, middle market, fast and ultra fast fashion sectors. H&M, for example, a well-known fast fashion retailer that manufactures in China and Bangladesh, saw their profits fall 5%. This, however, wasn't entirely unexpected, as China was expected to be hit with tariffs and fashion was kind of prepared for that. The real chaos came from the fact that these tariffs were also leveled at countries fashion wasn't expecting and had diversified their manufacturing to, after thinking that having all of their eggs in China's basket might be a risky bet given rising global tension. Shares in Nike, Adidas, and Puma also dropped sharply, which surprised the industry given that they largely manufacture in Vietnam, a country that wasn't expecting such high tariffs. Given that Nike manufactured 50% of its footwear in Vietnam in 2024, you can see why the stock prices might have dropped so sharply. In fact, pretty much every publicly traded fashion company experienced a drop in their shares of some kind. And one of my first thoughts was that I bet Shein and Temu are glad they haven't had the chance to IPO yet, although this is definitely still affecting them. The chaos in fashion hasn't just stopped in the stock market. Brands have almost been assembling war rooms to deal with the implications of these tariffs for their supply chain operations going forward. Vogue reported that brands were calling board meetings and were spending large amounts of time on the phone to suppliers in countries that were hit with these unexpected tariffs. Apparently, one US brand called a tariff tax force meeting a couple days after the tariffs were announced. Interestingly enough, Vogue did not mention any specific brands when they were reporting on this pandemonium, and said that when they were reaching out to brands to comment, there was a hesitation from those brands to be named in an article complaining about dealing with these tariffs for fear that Trump might retaliate specifically against them, which I think tells you a lot about how fashion believes Trump is working. You don't really need specific quotes from brands, however, to know that everyone is panicking that they might be cut off or put on the back foot with a supply chain that they heavily rely on, which for an industry already in trouble is another headache they definitely don't want. But before we go deeper into how fashion is reacting and what next steps I think they might take, let's take a step back to how fashion was preparing for this change already and how that might impact their future decisions. Because, okay, you probably know Trump has been threatening tariffs for a while now. It was a pretty significant part of his campaign to run for president again. And maybe the fashion industry didn't take it as seriously seriously as they should have, because they definitely weren't expecting this much change. But that doesn't mean moves weren't already being made in fashion before last week. Some brands have been attempting to butter up Trump for a while now in the hopes that it would play out in the long run. Bernard Arnault and some of his children were at Trump's inauguration in January. And according to sources of the New York Post, Bernard's primary motivation at the time was to show support for Trump, but also hopefully to convince Trump to spare his luxury conglomerate LVMH from the tariffs he was threatening at the time. Even before this though, LVMH has been hedging its bets on American manufacturing during Trump's first term, building 3 Louis Vuitton facilities in California and Texas and inviting Trump down to see them. Of course, all of that planning still didn't stop LVMH's stock dropping 3.5% the day after the tariffs were announced, and I'm sure Bernard Arnault is furious that his simping didn't make a difference. LVMH definitely isn't the only brand that's been thinking about the possibility of tariffs, and more broadly, most of the fashion industry had already put preemptive plans in place to start moving their supply chains to get around worsening geopolitics. This has kind of been a long-term plan, however, and brands have been slowly implementing it. But when these tariffs were first announced and fashion believed that they would be largely focused on China, these plans significantly sped up. Shein started offering incentives for their Chinese suppliers to move to Vietnam. And after the first round of tariffs, companies like Walmart announced that they will be negotiating with suppliers to bring costs down. And even right before the news of the tariffs hit, fashion was taking steps to mitigate the damage. Companies in and out of the fashion industry were warning markets that their stock prices might fall slightly due to an anti-American sentiment sweeping the rest of the world, and had already factored potential tariffs into their forecasts for this year. But no one could have predicted the shitstorm that happened, and how specifically it targeted many of fashion's manufacturing hubs. I guess now we should talk about the immediate fallout after Trump's actions. Well, for consumers already discovering what the end of de minimis means for their online shopping addictions, I'd say it's going to be a pretty bumpy road in the future as brands put these prices up even higher to contend with the ridiculous tariffs. And as a kind of like side weird footnote, I've found a lot of comments of people reacting to these increasing prices with some sort of sentiment of, are we going to have to go back to shopping at the mall in order to get around them? And I don't really understand what's going on here, considering that the prices of things are going to go up across the board, not just for online shopping only. But I think it's kind of interesting and kind of shows that there's a lot of misinformation out there about tariffs and the impacts it's going to have. So yeah, I think the impacts of this on consumers is going to be pretty volatile. And I'm going to come back to how I think this is going to be shifting consumer habits long term. But going into the immediate fallout for the fashion industry, some brands definitely have a lot more pieces to pick up than others. For the ones like Zara, who have played a very good long-term strategy by diversifying their supply chains across something like 50 countries, things aren't looking too bad because they can adapt to Trump's whims pretty easily. But just so we're clear, most of fashion is not in this position. Many only rely on 1 or 2 manufacturing hubs in 1 or 2 countries, and most of those countries will have been hit by tariffs. So there's a lot to contend with. As I said, fashion sort of thought they were prepared for the tariffs that they thought might just hit China and a few other countries. But now they're apparently blindsided and scrambling to move their goods and rethink pricing strategies. Manufacturers are bracing for price negotiations and order cancellations. And even though nobody's really in a great position now, with consumers facing higher prices, brands in a very volatile position, and suppliers worrying about losing clients, there's one real loser in this entire situation: the people we rely on to make our clothes. I covered in my Substack a few weeks ago the devastating impact these tariffs were going to be having on garment workers, back when we thought that the tariff situation wouldn't be this bad. And now we know what we know, I'm even more worried about how this is going to play out. Garment workers will be facing the brunt of job insecurity and price squeezing. Their already criminally undervalued labor may face even more cuts. The only people who might might be in the same position are the farmers and other lower levels of the supply chain who grow raw materials and turn them into fabric. The people on this level of the supply chain are entirely at the whims of the brands with power. And although I think brands might be worried about the negative press of pulling out of factories and leaving workers there high and dry, I think their bottom lines are going to matter more to them. And since there's little accountability or responsibility towards their offshore manufacturing contracts, there's little to stop brands breaking these contracts and moving somewhere else with lower tariffs as soon as they can. So, okay, I wanted to talk about my thoughts about how I think this is going to play out in fashion long term, both for consumer spending habits and also for brands and the fashion industry at large. Starting then with consumer interest, I think short term, it's going to just increase that interest we're already seeing from consumers to discover brands closer to them and avoid tariffs by shopping local. And I think we're going to continue to also see the rise of brands playing into this sentiment with their marketing. I think what's interesting is there might be a big divide in the global market here. TikTok has made trends very globalized. Everyone's sort of obsessed with the same thing at the same time. But we might see a massive divide in American markets versus the rest of the world markets and how that plays out in TikTok trends, say. So I'm interested in the potential of that. But thinking a little bit more long term, and this is maybe wishful thinking on my part, but I think we might start to see a decrease in consumption as consumers feel the impact of these rising prices, maybe. Brands like Shein and Temu, whose USP is cheap prices, will, I think, struggle to sell these bad quality clothes when their USP is gone. And just as I hope that consumption as a whole might go down, I think maybe our interests will be redirected to other methods of shopping, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I could definitely see this resulting in a rise of secondhand fashion, for example. And experts are predicting that the demand for resale items, especially those subject to domestic shipping, will increase, and so will their purchase price, especially for luxury goods. When I put out a call out on my Instagram story asking you guys the question of how you think fashion will react, I could kind of see these thoughts were mirrored. For example, one comment saying, hopefully brands will improve recycling techniques to lower costs is really interesting. And I think just in general, the rise of a circular economy of mending your clothes and reselling and swapping with your loved ones more might be a long-term reaction. Another kind of long-term prediction I'm thinking is that we as consumers may get used to waiting longer for an item that we've purchased. I think we will be forced to as fashion supply chains become more volatile and delays get more frequent. Again, this kind of works well with the potential rise of underconsumption as we slow down our trend cycles and learn to use what we have more. And I think it might result in a subsequent rise of upcycling or brands that offer upcycling as part of their services as we kind of use what we have and remake it into something new rather than buying new. Or, and this is probably the most wishful thinking, it might lead to a rise of brands doing a made-to-order model, which kind of inherently is a slow fashion model where consumers know that they'll be waiting longer and also addresses the issues of overproduction in the fashion cycle since there's no excess stock. But I think this would be a massive systems change in fashion, so I think maybe this is the most pipe dream of them all. But however, saying that, Vogue has called this entire situation an existential threat to fashion. I honestly think that this could be the kind of event fashion needs to redesign its entire system if it takes the opportunity. It could be a kind of forced scenario where brands have to scale back on their operations and limit what they're creating and pivot away from this race to the bottom mentality that we've been seeing. And although this is not a good situation in any respect because of how it's going to be impacting garment workers globally, and like I said, those lower on the supply chain that don't have any power in this scenario, it could definitely have some pros in slowing overconsumption. And if this whole thing had been done more responsibly by Trump, given more time, more incentives for suppliers to upskill their workers, or, just given brands more time to think this whole thing through, it could have potentially not been so bad. But, that's not what happened. We're here now, and the entire fashion industry is in chaos. Speaking of, let's talk about my predictions for the impacts for brands and the fashion industry. And this is a really hard one because the entire situation is so speculative. Trump keeps changing his mind, going back on his word, escalating things as world leaders come back to him with reciprocal tariffs. And if I were managing a fashion brand, I'd be hesitant to put any long-term changes in place dependent on this very recent news. Because with one tweet from Trump, it could be useless. And all that hard work and all those new plans could be completely upended. Like the fact that despite the surprise tariffs, Trump announced at the end of last week that he'd had a call with Vietnam, and then the companies manufacturing primarily in the nation, like Nike and Lululemon, saw a boost in their share prices because Trump in one day had completely changed the situation. Like, there's just no forward planning here. There's no guarantee that Trump is going to stick to any of his words. And it makes the entire situation so volatile that you can't long-term plan. You literally just have to roll with it as it goes. But I think one thing we can't ignore is that Trump seems to be holding on to the idea of reviving the made in the USA domestic garment manufacturing. And he in fact mentioned this in his address. So there could be some benefits to brands investing in this. Although, however, experts warn that there will be many, many challenges rebuilding this sector in the US, and that it really could just be a pipe dream for Trump. But that's kind of like long-term thinking. I think short-term, the real losers of this situation for brands is going to be small businesses. They're going to be absolutely struggling under the weight of increased tariffs and consumers not being willing to pay more for what they already perceive as being higher priced than fast fashion, for example. And I think we might be seeing a lot of small businesses closing, which has already been a trend in fashion for a while now. So I think this will only exacerbate that. This in turn is going to have knock-on effects of increasing the monopoly of big brands in the market. It's just going to leave the big players who can swallow these costs with little repercussions, or I guess less repercussion. Going back to long-term strategies here, because I think this is really interesting. If I, again, were to be managing a fashion brand, I think I would be weighing up the advantages of nearshoring and domestic production. Whilst I wouldn't necessarily be thinking about the US as a new manufacturing hub, I do think the idea of nearshoring, i.e. putting factories close to your big markets to reduce the logistics and increase the oversight of supply chains there, would be a good idea. It's risky because it will drive up costs short term, and it's obviously not great for the garment workers you'd be leaving behind in the current established markets. But purely from a profit and a stability of business point of view, I think nearshoring might be the solution for brands. I mean, I'm not head of a brand. I'm not behind the curtain on these discussions. So if you are, or if you have another idea that you think brands could be doing, then please comment them below. I'm so interested in what the potential ideas could be here, because as I'm seeing it now, there's a very limited scope for brands to react to this well. And I think, again, the real winners of this situation will be the ones who have been pre-planning and have already sort of tried to diversify their supply chains as much as possible. Zara, who has manufacturing hubs in 50 different countries, but also the brands that have been investing slowly in US, like LVMH. Because as long as they can keep up with the demand for the US market with their manufacturing hubs in the US and maybe separate that from the rest of their global production, then they would be able to cater to both the US market and the global demographic without raising prices too much for consumers. And that's quite important, especially in luxury, because we've seen a rise in consumer sentiment that luxury products are way too high now. So putting that up is definitely not going to go well with consumers. And I think brands will try to avoid it at all costs. So I do think LVMH is in a pretty good position if they can guarantee that US domestic production. But there's a massive issue with the made in the US label, and I'm not an expert here, but from what I understand, the US manufacturing economy is going to be difficult to scale. There's little infrastructure, issues with getting labor, and obviously the price of that labor is going to be much higher than fashion is used to with developing countries that don't charge as much or don't have as much labor laws in place. I know that the US does have some manufacturing hubs left, mainly in Los Angeles, I believe, but the focus there is a lot on denim and knitwear. And obviously that's not the entirety of the fashion scope. So you really are going to have to be investing as a brand into this solution. And I'm not sure that the pros will outweigh how volatile the US is right now. I don't know. You're kind of weighing up the US market's potential with Trump's erratic behavior, and that's pretty hard. I'm so interested to see how this plays out for the fashion industry specifically. If I haven't conveyed this enough, I think this is a terrible, irresponsible situation Trump has put the entire fashion industry in, and it's going to have real repercussions on the most vulnerable people in fashion and in consumers who have to swallow the cost of these rising products. And although it could have potential benefits, like fashion potentially slowing down their trend cycles and production levels, this is not the way you go about that. This is not a good scenario for anyone short term, and there will be real losers, as I've said. So that's kind of my take on this, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this entire situation, if I've missed anything out, if there's a whole other scope to this I've not seen yet. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Instagram, where I do call out posts for these videos and where all of the comments you saw on screen came from. And with that, have a lovely day. If you want to watch another video, the one on screen is the one YouTube thinks you'll like the best, but if not, I'll speak to you really soon. Bye.